Tariffs are essentially taxes placed on imported goods, and they play a major role in shaping a country's economic landscape. By making foreign products more expensive for American consumers and businesses, tariffs can influence what people buy and how companies operate. The main goal is to protect domestic industries by encouraging people to buy American-made products, which in turn can help support local jobs and manufacturing. President Trump has made tariffs a cornerstone of his America First economic agenda, using them as leverage in tough trade negotiations with other countries. In 2025, his administration imposed aggressive new tariffs, some as high as 50% on certain imports, specifically targeting countries like China, Mexico, and Canada, which are major U.S. trading partners. The stated reason for these tariffs was to pressure these nations to curb the flow of illegal fentanyl into the U.S., linking trade policy directly to national security concerns and the fight against drug trafficking. This marks a sharp break from previous administrations, which generally favored free trade, lower barriers, and international cooperation to boost economic growth. Trump argues that tariffs are necessary to counter what he calls unfair foreign practices, level the playing field, and bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. heartland. Supporters say tariffs help domestic industries, create jobs, and strengthen the American economy by making it less dependent on foreign goods. Meanwhile, critics warn that tariffs raise costs for American companies and consumers, making it harder for families and small businesses to afford everyday products. Higher import costs can lead to inflation, making everyday goods more expensive and putting additional pressure on household budgets across the country. The debate is a trade-off: protect certain industries and jobs, or risk higher prices for everyone else. It's a balancing act with real consequences for millions. Tariffs have become both an economic and political weapon, reshaping America's approach to global trade and sparking fierce debate about the nation's future direction. Trump's 2025 tariffs quickly faced a major legal challenge, as critics argued they overstepped presidential authority and threatened to upend established trade law. On August 29, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit issued a landmark decision, ruling against the administration in a closely watched case that drew national attention. By a decisive 7-4 vote, the court found the president lacked the legal authority to impose such sweeping tariffs without explicit congressional approval. The judges pointed to the Constitution's origination clause, which gives Congress, not the president, the power to levy taxes, including tariffs, reinforcing the separation of powers at the heart of American government. The administration had relied on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, as its legal basis, arguing that it provided the necessary authority in times of national emergency. But the court said IEPA doesn't give the president explicit power to impose broad tariffs. That authority must come directly from Congress, not through emergency statutes. The court warned that using emergency powers for massive tariffs would shift a core legislative function to the executive branch, undermining the checks and balances designed to prevent overreach. Recognizing the economic disruption and immediate change could cause, the court delayed its ruling until October 14, giving businesses and markets time to adjust. This pause gives the administration time to appeal to the Supreme Court, setting the stage for a potentially historic legal showdown. For now, the tariffs remain in place, but the legal battle is far from over, and uncertainty looms over the future of U.S. trade policy. The stakes are enormous. Nearly 70% of U.S. imports and the delicate balance of power between Congress and the president hang in the balance. All eyes now turn to the Supreme Court, which will decide the fate of the tariffs and the limits of executive power in the months ahead. After the appeals court setback, the Trump administration found itself facing a rapidly closing window to act. The team moved fast, scrambling to coordinate a legal response and strategize their next steps amid mounting pressure. On September 2, President Trump announced an immediate appeal to the Supreme Court, seeking an expedited ruling that could halt the lower court's decision before it took effect. The urgency was clear: if the Supreme Court doesn't act by October 14, the tariffs will be lifted automatically, potentially triggering major changes overnight. The administration argues that removing the tariffs suddenly would destabilize the economy, disrupt global markets, and undermine national security interests. Trump publicly warned that ending the tariffs could harm the stock market, threaten American jobs, and weaken America's global standing at a critical moment. The request for a fast-track review is rare, reserved only for cases of exceptional national importance and urgency. The administration must convince the justices that the potential economic disruption and the challenge to presidential authority justify bypassing the usual slower process. The Supreme Court's first decision will be whether to grant this expedited review, a move that could set a precedent for future urgent cases. If they agree, the case could be heard and decided in record time, with the nation watching closely. The outcome will determine not just the fate of the tariffs, but also the scope of presidential power in shaping U.S. trade policy for years to come. The legal and political stakes are enormous, with ripple effects that could reach far beyond this administration. All eyes are now on the Supreme Court, as the nation awaits a decision that could reshape the balance of power and the future of American trade. Trump's tariff strategy is rooted in economic nationalism, protecting American industries and workers from what he calls decades of unfair global trade. He argues that tariffs are essential to restore U.S. manufacturing and economic sovereignty. The administration links the 2025 tariffs to national security, claiming they pressure countries like China and Mexico to help stop fentanyl trafficking. This broadens the definition of national security to include public health and transnational crime. Trump's team insists the president needs flexible powers to act quickly in emergencies, without waiting for Congress. Supporters say the tariffs have boosted certain industries and sent a message of American strength. At the heart of the case is the Constitution's separation of powers. Opponents argue only Congress can impose taxes and tariffs, and that Trump overstepped by using IEPA for a sweeping tax on imports. They say IEPA was never meant to grant the president such broad authority, especially without explicit language from Congress. Legal experts point to recent Supreme Court decisions requiring clear congressional approval for major policy changes. Trump's lawyers counter that IEPA's broad language gives the president flexibility to respond to emergencies, including economic threats. They argue the fentanyl crisis justifies the tariffs and that courts should defer to the president on national security. The Supreme Court must decide, does IEPA allow this kind of sweeping action, or did Trump go too far? The answer could redefine the limits of presidential power. Both sides look to Supreme Court precedent. Opponents cite the 2022 Biden v. Nebraska case, where the court struck down student loan forgiveness, saying major policy moves need clear congressional approval, the major questions doctrine. They argue Trump's tariffs, affecting 70% of imports, are just as significant and lack explicit authorization under IEEPA. However, Trump's team points to past rulings upholding broad presidential power in trade, like the 2018 steel tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. That law explicitly allows the president to act if imports threaten national security. The justices face a recent skepticism of executive overreach versus a tradition of deference on foreign policy. Which precedent will guide the court's decision? The answer could reshape the balance of power for years to come. The Supreme Court's decision will have immediate, far-reaching consequences. If Trump wins, the president's power to use emergency laws for economic policy will be affirmed, and the tariffs will stay. This would be a major victory for economic nationalism, but keep prices high for businesses and consumers. It could also set a precedent for future presidents to use emergency powers for sweeping economic changes. If the court rules against Trump, the tariffs will be struck down, slashing the share of imports subject to tariffs from 70% to 16%. Prices for many goods could fall, and Congress's authority over trade and taxation would be reasserted. The decision will clarify the limits of presidential power and reshape American trade policy. For now, the country waits for the Supreme Court's next move. The stakes, the future of U.S. trade, the economy, and the constitutional balance of power. The verdict will echo far beyond the courtroom.